During the week, I teach driving, and one of the things that you quickly realize when you're teaching driving is that you always got to make sure that that window's cracked a little bit. I learned that from the examiners that give the road tests. They always have the road, and here's why: because sometimes you get in with certain people and I don't know if they don't have proper hygiene but I've been in the car with certain people and there's certain smells that you can't get away from, and you got to crack that window a little bit. And when I tell you, sometimes it burns my eyes, it's so bad. And as you're talking with these people, you're trying not to. I remember one guy, his breath was just horrible, and he would talk with me, and I would and I would roll over and want to crawl in the back seat, and as a result, I always cracked that window. But here's the problem, you see. I'm struggling with my hearing. I'm blaming it on Dad. Dad needed a hearing aid, and he would not go. He would not get that hearing aid, and we would tell him, Dad, you can't hear what we're saying, and he would get sentences mixed up. We would say something, and he'd get it all, and it was because he just couldn't hear. So, Dad, it's your fault. I'm the same way now. I just can't. So often what will happen is my students will say something to me, and I'll have to say, what? Can you say it again? And they would repeat it. One guy, I said, I'm really sorry. I'm having a hard time hearing you. And I'd always have to put the window up because that was a distraction to me, because I would always hear the road a little bit clearer, but then I couldn't hear what was being said over here. So I'd have to close that window. And what I'd have to do is I'd have to lean in and really give my attention to hearing what they said. Then I'd get it. Well, I realized that a lot of us, we don't hear God very well. And we have a lot of distractions around us. And as a result of not hearing Him, sometimes when He calls us to go to the Philippines, we don't hear that. We hear, He wants me to go to Hawaii. Noah, and the story of Noah, but particularly Noah and chapter 6, he gives us, I think, a key to understanding and hearing God. I want to read to you Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 to 22. It's from the New International Version. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. And the Lord regretted that He had made human beings on the earth, and His heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I'll wipe out from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And this is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood and make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening cubit high all around. Put a deck in the in the side of the ark and make a lower, middle, and upper decks. I'm going to bring flood waters on the earth and destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, and keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Noah did everything just as God commanded. There was a constant in Noah's life. And here was the constant, the thing that he was adamantly devoted to, a constant. The constant was this: Noah walked faithfully with God. That's what it says. Noah walked faithfully with God. This is the constant in his life. The fact that he was faithful to this task, that he didn't stray from it. It was something he did faithfully. And I say did faithfully. Relationships, you see, and that's what we're talking about here, a relationship with God. Noah walked with God. He had a relationship with God. He was faithful to this relationship. Relationships don't just happen. Maybe at first, but then you and I, we have to maintain them, right? How many people have you met, you've been friends with, but there's been years and years and years and years and years that have gone by? Are they still friends? You might call them still friends, but let's be honest, they're more of acquaintances now. Relationships don't just happen. We have to maintain them. We have to work at them. You have to be with each other. You have to write to each other. You have to text each other. You have to email each other. You have to stay connected. There's an effort required. You talk, they talk. You do things together. You have memories together. But to be faithful means that you take the time. You make the effort to maintain that friendship, that relationship. You're committed to it. If a relationship is a one-way deal, and I know a lot of you have had one-way relationships, it doesn't work very well. Usually, those are the ones that turned into acquaintances. Noah walked faithfully with God. That's what it says. That was the constant. Now think about it. When you walk with somebody, you're next to them. You're close in proximity. Otherwise, you aren't really walking with them. Maybe you're walking way ahead of them or behind them. But in order to walk with somebody, there's got to be a closeness that's there. You need that close proximity so you can talk to them, so they can hear you. You need that close proximity so they can talk to you and you can hear them. When you're walking with somebody, you're sort of leaning in, like I do with my students. You're giving attention to what they're saying. Noah walked with God and was faithful in that endeavor. They were close. They talked. They knew each other's voices. How many times, I have 2 girls at my office, and they call me from the office to let me know, okay, a student canceled. And Vanessa and Sylvia, and I get their names, I get their voices mixed up all the time. Why? Because I haven't spent a tremendous amount of time with each of them. But I'll bet somebody that they're close with would immediately know their voice. Do you know God's voice? The closer we are to him, the closer we hear his voice, the more we recognize it. Now, there's something else that was powerful here, and it said that God spoke and Noah heard him. That's what he says, right? He says, God said to Noah. God spoke, Noah heard. Noah knew it was God. He knew it was God's voice because he walked faithfully with him. That is the constant. Secondly, let me jump into that. God spoke. God spoke. So God said to Noah, make yourself an ark. Now this is, what do you immediately notice about that passage that I said, that I read? If you read that God spoke and he said something to Noah, there's no questioning on Noah's part. That's what we should immediately notice. No questioning. Now, here's why that should surprise us. And how did the conversation go? Let me just kind of elaborate or use my imagination. Okay. God says to Noah, Noah, I want you to go build an ark. Okay. What's an ark? Noah, it's a boat. What's a boat? Noah, the things that float on the top of the water. Okay, all right. I'm going to bring a flood on the earth. I'm going to make it rain for 40 days and 40 nights. God, what's rain? It had never rained. It had never rained. He was far from any rivers. This dude had no idea what God was saying. And God was very detailed. And yet it says he did what God asked. He didn't even understand it fully, but he did it. Why? Because God said it. Because God spoke. Moses questioned. Go to Exodus chapter 3. God spoke to Moses in this burning bush. We all know the story. Look how Moses was using every excuse in the book to get out of doing it. He was questioning God. Why do you need me? God, I can't talk very well. God, finally he just says, God, can you use somebody else? No, Moses, you. He finally got a little tired, put his foot down. Of Moses' complaining. But Moses was one of the greatest heroes of the Old Testament. He questioned. Noah didn't question. When God calls, he equips. He called Jasmine to go to the Philippines. He equipped her. And there's results that happen too, and the results are his. Noah was probably really excited at first when he got this call from God. You know, once he understood that I'm going to build this ark, this boat, and it's going to be salvation for me and my family. I'm sure he was fed up with the evil around him, and he was so excited that, yeah, God is finally putting his foot down. He's going to do something about this, and I'm going to be saved, and my family's going to be saved. And I'm sure that he was excited with the task at first. Now think about it. How do you think he felt after 10 years? What about 25 years? 50 years. I think at 50-year mark, he's probably like that old Dunkin' Donuts commercial, time to make the donuts, you know. He's just, it's routine. I just got to get up and time to tar and pitch the boat, time to cut the lumber. What about after 100 years? Because it says that it took him about 110, 120 years to finish that boat. Why? How? How in the world could he keep going? We got to go back to the constant. God encouraged him onward. It was God's plan, not his plan. He knew God spoke because he was close to him, because he walked faithfully with God. Back to his constant. He heard God, God spoke, God encouraged. That's why he could do this for over 100 years. And then Noah built the ark. He was faithful to the task, even when it took a lot longer than he expected. Even when it didn't make sense to him, Noah knew that it was God's plan, not Noah's plan. Yet, Noah was able to distinguish God's voice over his own because he'd walked so closely with him. Now let's stop here and think for a moment. Why is this important for us to understand this? How do we know when it's God speaking to us and not our own desires, our own wants that are talking in our head? How do we distinguish God's voice over our own voice? You gotta go back to the constant. How faithfully are you walking with God? Do you have a relationship with him? Because we're not talking religion here. Religion is man-made. We're talking about a personal relationship with God. We're talking about walking with him, about knowing him, and him knowing us. You know, when we're walking close to him, we know it's his voice. Now, I don't hear a voice. God doesn't speak to me in an audible voice, but I know it's him when he's talking to me. I can feel it down here. I know it. And it always is confirmed and clarified by his word. How often do we get caught up with our own fleshly desires, our own earthly perspectives, and we begin to focus in on that, and we begin to think that that's God? You know, we don't see things the way he does. He sees the whole picture. We have a small view. We have our plans, and sometimes we try to fit God into our plans. And we convince ourselves that it's God who's doing this. Oh, it's you who are doing it. Because we're not hearing him. So we try to fit him in to our plans, instead of letting him take the lead. And that gets us into a lot of trouble. I heard of an old rural preacher. I've used this story before, and I can't even tell you where it comes from. I can't even tell you who this preacher was, but an old rural preacher, and he was asked to speak at a small church in the country. And as he always did, he prayed about the invitation, and he felt as if God was telling him to go. So he said, I'll go. And here he showed up on that morning, and to his surprise, no one else showed up. So here he was standing in an empty church with a message that he'd already prepared. And since he felt that it was God who directed him to accept this invitation and go, he did what he normally did. He delivered his message to an empty church and then quietly left. What he didn't know is there was a guy sitting under the open window on the side of the church who had just woken up from a previous night of drinking. There was an empty whiskey bottle next to him telling the tale, and he listened. He listened that day to this preacher preaching this message from this open window that he sat underneath while he nursed his hangover. And on that morning, he gave his life to Jesus Christ. And his life changed, and he went on to become this renowned evangelist. And that preacher, he had no idea why he was there. It didn't make sense to him. Why would God tell him to do? But he did it anyway because God spoke, and he heard him because he was close. He was walking closely with the Lord, and he went. And he didn't deliver a message to thousands and millions. To one guy he did. And that one guy delivered that message to millions. When I started Crossland so many years ago, I was filled with excitement. I knew God had called me to do it, to start this church from scratch. Those first years, I got to tell you, I wanted to quit the task every day. I had that battle daily. And then after a while, it was weekly. Then after a while, it was monthly. And I wasn't sure of the why behind it all, because you see, it didn't go exactly the way I had hoped or thought it would. But I knew there was a reason why we were doing it. And in fact, I can remember some of those instances I was ready to throw the towel in, and God spoke to Margaret and said, "It's not time." And to my dismay, she said, "Nope, it's not. We're not supposed to stop." But if I hadn't have done that, I wouldn't be here. So we never know what the results are going to be. And we form these plans in our head and determine how things are going to go. But you see, God might want us in an empty church preaching to no people because somebody is outside and needs to hear. Because somebody saw you being faithful as you walked with the Lord. And what are the results? Noah and his family were saved. The human race survived. The ark brought salvation to them all. It didn't make sense at the time. Noah did it anyway and stuck with it for over 100 years, all because God said so. When God speaks and we courageously examine our own motives and our own desires and pray about the decision, God's voice gets a little clearer. And I don't think it's because he raises his voice louder. I think, you see, it's because we lean in and ask him, "Can you talk again? Can you say that one more time?" And now our attention is there. Now we're focused on what he's saying. We have no distractions, no windows open. We need to stop demanding to see things from our perspective. We need to stop needing the why question answered, because sometimes we're not going to understand the why, even if he did explain it to us. That's why, you see, it's his plan and not our plan. I remember being in a cave one time. We were going on a little cave tour. And at one point, we were down at the bottom, and it's really dark. You know, they get you down in there, and the bats are flying around, and they shut the lights off, show you how dark it is. And at one point, he said, "Okay, it's about time for us to start back up," because we had gone down into the cave, and we were going to go back up and go out. And imagine my I thought it was just awful strange that the guy took this path and we started to go down. And in my mind, I'm thinking, dude, you just said we're going out. Why are you going back down deeper? That didn't make any sense to me. Until we got to the bottom of this trail, and there were steps going up. Sometimes we have to go down before we can go up. And it doesn't make sense to us. It doesn't make sense to us. But it does to God, because it's his plan. Joseph, in the Bible, he needed to be sold into slavery. He needed to be sold to the particular slave traders that his brothers sold him to, because they were headed to Egypt. So his brothers unknowingly were part of God's plan. And so they sold him, and he got bought by a guy named Potiphar, right? And his wife wanted Joseph. And Joseph knew that was wrong, so he ran, but she accused him of abusing her. And Potiphar knew that what his wife was like, but he also had to save face. So he sent Joseph to prison. Now, he could have killed Joseph, but he didn't. Instead, he sent him into prison. And Joseph needed to be in that prison at that time with a baker and the king's cup holder. He needed to be there at that time because they had dreams. And he was able to interpret those dreams. And even when the one got killed and the other one went back to Pharaoh and forgot all about Joseph, he needed to forget about Joseph, because Joseph, at the right time, at the right moment, when the Pharaoh had a disturbing dream, This man said, there's a guy in prison that told me my dream, and he was right. Let's bring him up. And they brought him up. Now, he had been walking closely with the Lord, and now suddenly he came up. He told Pharaoh his dream. He ended up being second in command of all Egypt. The salvation for the Israelites and the nation of Israel and his family. You see, he needed to go down because he needed to be at that place, at that time, at that moment, in order to go up. It doesn't make sense to us, but God has his plan. King David in the Bible, he needed to be chased by Saul. He needed to run for his life. He needed to be hiding in these caves in the mountains. Why? Because there's a bunch of guys that came to him while he was in those caves. They were misfits. They were outcasts. They were running from Saul too. Little did they know they were going to become an elite fighting force fully devoted to their leader. And they went down in history books as the mighty men of David. That place in the wilderness molded David into the king that he would become. It's where David called out to God. It's where David leaned in a little closer and heard God's voice a little bit louder. It's a guy named Paul, wrote most of our New Testament. He needed to be Saul. He needed to be humbled by God. He needed to be blinded on the road to Damascus so he could finally see Jesus. He needed to be humbled, and he needed to be held in the grips of grace so he could understand grace and be able to preach it to everyone else. Over and over, we see people in the Bible that have to go down before they can get up. Because when they were down is where they called out, is where they leaned in, is where they heard God's voice, where they began to distinguish it over their own. And that's when they became obedient to the call. That's when they learned to trust, even when it didn't make sense. And their faith expanded and deepened. In all these stories, people involved had to run back to their constant, walking with God closely. Maybe God won't call you to be a king, a preacher, or build an ark. Maybe he won't call you to go to the Philippines. Maybe he will ask you to love your neighbor who's nasty. Maybe he'll call you to reach out in friendship to somebody who isn't very friendly. Maybe he'll call you to endure a situation that most would quit on. Maybe he'll call you just to be yourself in a world that teaches us how to be fake. The reasons are going to vary, but the constant is always going to be the same. The closer we lean into him, the clearer we're going to hear his voice. The closer we lean into him, the more we're going to walk with him faithfully. He doesn't want us to run ahead of him. He doesn't want us to walk behind him, you see. He wants us to walk with him. After all, it's hard to hear someone. It's hard to hear their voice. It's hard to distinguish their voice when you're way ahead or way behind. It's a relationship, you see. And that's why he wants us with him, because he loves us. He loves to be with us. He wants us to walk with him. And we always come back to that point, that constant. Do you have a relationship with Jesus Christ? I'm not talking religion. Do you have a relationship? Do you talk with him? Do you know him? If not, it's the easiest thing to change, you see, because he wants you with him. He wants you walking with him. He wants you to hear his call when he calls. He wants you to be part of his plans because they're what's best. So ask him, God, I don't know how this deal works, but I want a relationship with you. Jesus, I want a relationship with you. I understand you're up there and I'm here, but I want a relationship with you. Can I have a relationship with you? That's what he's yearning to hear that. Don't get caught up in religion. Get caught up in a relationship, and you'll never be the same. Let's close in a word of prayer before we go to the communion table. Father, we just thank you so much for your word, for these stories of these men that went on before us, these women that went on before us, Father, and they walked closely and faithfully with you. Lord, I pray that you would put your hand on each one of us. You would draw us into a loving, abiding relationship with you. Father, I pray that we would learn to lean in closer, to hear your voice. And Lord, I pray that you would allow us to decipher your voice over our desires and our wants and our perspectives. Lord, I pray that you would do above and beyond whatever we can imagine or dream of in our life and through our life as a result of this. In Jesus' name, amen. We always come back to Jesus. We always come back to Jesus because he's the one that broke down the veil and allows us to have this personal relationship with God. And so as we hand out the elements, the bread and the cup, be thinking about your own relationship with Christ. Do you need to lean in closer? Maybe you need to ask him, hey, because of Jesus, I can have a relationship with you, and that's what I'd like. Maybe for the first time.